All right, Shalom. You reached the Heat Pray channel. My name is Isaac Mawath. But first and foremost, I want to say, Call Halayim Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shai Bahashim Haruchach Kodash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Hadarak, the Way. 2,000 years ago, they were referred to as the Way. They were the followers of the Way being Yahweh Shai. The equivalent of the Way today would be the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, where I learned this truth from, who rule well. Salutations to the Bakiyar, the elect, the 144,000. That's 12,000 men from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel consist of you so-called blacks, Latinos, and indigenous of America. The 144,000 being the governing body within the one-third. The rest of the one-third comprises of elect men, women, and children. Shalom to you Israelites scattered due to the diaspora and also the triangle of trade. So our people come looking like different ethnicities, having various complexions. So this is not a black thing. We're not the black Hebrew Israelites. We're just Hebrew Israelites. Shalom to those that died in this truth. It says the dead should be raised up first. Those that will be accompanying Yahweh Shah on his return, including our King, King Mashah, who is King David. And as always, it's an honor and privilege, honor and blessing to continue to do this work. The Water Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua Ba'ashim Harakhakwadash for answering my prayers and permitting me to do such. Babu Kashah Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua Ba'ashim Harakhakwadash. Allow this to be an edifying lesson to at least one member of the elect. And I want to say the Water Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua for maintaining the spirit within me to be committed, to the vow that I made for myself and for Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua. As each video I do is a testament to me upholding that vow. So I just want to say the Water Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua for all the things that he does for the elect and, for a sinner like me. So the title of this video is going to be, which I'm probably going to extend it, so let's see where am I at. It says, grieve the enemy, so they react violently. Because we live in a society where it's damn if you do and damn if you don't. Because Esau, he doesn't want to see progression amongst you so-called blacks, Latinos, and indigenous. So if you say you are educated or you have these certain degrees or, you're doing good in business, you have your own business and you're thriving, they don't want to hear that because then that becomes a threat to them. They rather you being a deviant, a demon, so they could pinpoint and demonize you to justify, well, this is the reason why we need these ends, these spics or these tontos locked up. This is the reason why we need them back into slavery. Their agenda is not for us to do good for ourselves, because that progression threatens their existence. And the ultimate knowledge that they fear is the knowledge of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua. And with that knowledge, you're moved, you're provoked to follow the law, statutes, and commandments. That is the ultimate threat to their rulership, you know. So that's why it's important for an Israelite man to be in the life of his children, to teach his children the ways of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua, man. And that's the reason why um, this devil, you know, um, um, for lack of better words, this is the reason why this devil removed the man out of the house, right? He removed that foundation, you know, and that's why our houses are destroyed. And how did he do that? He used the woman. You know, that's why it says in certain scriptures, it says the woman is your enemy, you know, because she has a feeble mind, right? But this is the book of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus. And I'm going to start at the top. This is Sirach chapter 30, verse 1. It says, he that loveth his son causeth him oft to feel the rod. You know, that's dealing with discipline. You know, now sometimes discipline involves you, you know, whipping your child, man. And when you even observe nature, even these animals discipline their children or discipline their offspring, man. You know, so what's so different about man? But the way that Esau sets up his laws, you know, your children could call the police and the police can call CPS and take your children away, man. And then they do those things with these undisciplined children because they know eventually they're going to be undisciplined and following orders. And that will make them highly likely to break Esau's law to become a slave within his penitentiary system, you know? So when you deal with the scriptures, you're supposed to give your children whippings from time to time, man. Now, not overboard, but with using wisdom, man. Not to the point where you're breaking bones and, you know, you're inducing lacerations and causing them to bleed. No, man, just enough for them to understand that um, what they were doing was wrong, you know, just enough for them to consider. And you really shouldn't do it in a time in which you're angry, you know, because anger will cause you to go overboard, you know. And a lot of these men in this society, they don't know how to control their anger, right? It says that he may have joy of him in the end. And a lot of you don't have joy of your children in the end because you were always against, you know, discipline. And discipline your children, man. You know, and that's why on social media and dealing with these so-called celebrities, you know, they're showcasing, you know, the scripture because they're not having joy in their children at the end, because all their children are locked up or being charged with certain things that if they would have had that discipline, they would have knew not to engage in those certain things, man. You know, which this is what the enemy, the so-called white man Esau, this is what he wants. He wants you to have undisciplined children, man. He wants you to be undisciplined. But when you become disciplined and your children are disciplined, that's what grieves him, because you know that is a threat to his progression. It says, "He that chasteneth his son shall have joy in him." And right now, if you're a son of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua, you're being spiritually chastened, you know, and caused to be disciplined. And that grieves the enemy, man. And eventually, that's going to cause him to act violently, because there's going to be a persecution that is coming, man. It says, "And shall rejoice of him among his acquaintance," right? Because, you could, uh, what's the good word to use? I don't want to say brag. I want to say talk in a righteous, good manner about how your son or your daughter's character is, which a lot of these people, they can't do about their children. They can't talk about, oh yeah, my son, he's this and that and the third, but oh, he's locked up for murder for hire, or he's locked up for felony DUI. He killed, you know, two or three people driving the wrong way, man. You want to be able to talk among your acquaintances righteously about your children, you know. Verse 3, it says, he that teacheth his son grieveth the enemy. And, that's what is happening on a spiritual level and a physical level, man. The spiritual level is spirit of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua Ba'ashim HaRachakodash is teaching his sons the elect, man. Therefore, that grieveth the principalities that are set against us. And translates into the children of Satan in this world, man. And these different left-hand sided spirits. That's why they say, oh, we're unsufferable, we're unbearable, we're this, that, and the third, man. All because we were taught the truth, and we're not one of those that, oh, they can mock and step over because we're out of our mind on some sort of narcotic or we're inebriated, right? Because that's not a threat to their progression. But when we're taught it's a threat to their progression, it says, "And before his friends he shall rejoice of him. Though his father die, yet he is as though he were not dead," because you continue that righteousness within your legacy, within your lineage, and then that father comes back um, down the line, and those same principles are instilled in that same lineage. It says, "For he have left one behind him that is like himself, which he lived, he saw and rejoiced in him, and when he died, he was not sorrowful." So he wasn't sorrowful that, his offspring didn't have the tools, instilled in them to live righteously in a righteous life, right? Which that brings success. It says, "He left behind him a avenger against his enemies, and one that shall requite kindness to his friends." He that maketh too much of his son shall bind up his wounds, and his bowels will be troubled at every cry. A horse not broken becometh headstrong, and a child left to himself will be willful. And that's why it's not good to, keep your children secluded, man. You know, keep them locked up all the time, because you don't feel like being a parent, because then resentment sets in, and, you know, then becoming headstrong and then wanting to see what the world is, therefore becoming willful. It says, conquer thy child, and he shall make thee afraid. Play with him, and he will bring thee to heaviness. And that's why you can't be a friend to your children. You have to be a parent, right? It says, laugh not with him, lest thou have sorrow with him, and lest thou gnash thy teeth in the end. Give him no liberty in his youth, and weep not at his follies. Right? Give him no liberty, meaning, you got to keep a watchful eye over him. Don't let him just do whatever he wants to do, but set rules, which is not a contradiction to what I just said about, you shouldn't keep him locked up, where all they're doing is just looking out of the window, and that's their only grasp and view of the world, but you could let them go and, have friends in the neighborhood, or, go certain places. But you will have to do that at a set time, where you have confidence that he has that discipline and that education that you instilled in him, that he could draw out in times of need, before he has those liberties, right? Because it's dealing with youth, and that's before the age of 12, because the age of 12, a boy becomes a man. And that's why you saw Yahweh Shai in the temple teaching at the age of 12, which was um, the age in which he became a man. It says, and weep not at his follies. Bow down his neck while he is young, and that's to keep him humble, and beat him on the sides while he is a child, lest he wax stubborn and be disobedient unto thee, and so bring sorrow to thy heart. Chastise thy son and hold him to labor, right? Put him to work, lest his lewd behavior be an offense unto thee. Better is the poor being sound and strong of constitution than a rich man that is afflicted in his body, right? Which that's going into something else. So it's good to chastise thy son and hold him to labor, put him to work. If you have a job that you could take him along with you, then take him along with you so he could understand, the benefits of being a hard worker. Which the scriptures say, you don't eat if you don't work, or if you don't work, you don't eat. Going back to co-pilot, it says, he that teacheth his son grieveth the enemy, and before his friends he shall rejoice of him. Vashuan Kodash. Ha Ayash Ha Ah Ha, Aisha, Halamad, Banya, uh, Ya Atazar, La Abya, um, Ramad to teach, train, discipline to shape through instruction, right? And what is a woman gonna do trying to instruct a man or a man child? You know, she's gonna be pushing her own demonic twist, you know, and that's what Esau, our enemy, that's what he wants. You know, this is a Yab, enemy, adversary, uh, one hostile toward you. That's the thing that our people have forgot, that this Edomite is our enemy, our adversary, one that is hostile towards us. You know, that's why they're laughing and trying to thumb it in our face, or however that saying goes, thumbing their nose in our face about how, you know, they're they got this group on Facebook that has these people that work in these restaurants doing things to so-called black people's food. You know, now they're pushing that as a talking point, but you know, really, you Jake shouldn't even be eating at these restaurants, man. You know, now I understand that, you know, sometimes you don't really feel like cooking, or you don't really have time, your schedule, you know, but you have to understand we living in dangerous times now, man. Especially as this society keeps circling, you know. So really, it's beneficial for you to either plan ahead or, you know, just uh, cook something that is light, something that doesn't take that long to cook, man, or just make some sandwiches, man. You know, but stay out of these restaurants, stay out of these, you know, non-Jake establishments. You know, this is a to czar, to vex, restrain, trouble, grieve. You know, so when you teach your children, you grieve, you trouble your enemies, man, because now it's a threat to their progression. And the rise of Jake, the Quam of Yasha Allah, has always been a threat to these Edomites, man. Layman commentary: teaching your son, building him with discipline, wisdom, and order hurts the enemy because it strengthens your lineage. A trained son becomes a defender of the household, a continuation of your strength, and a disruption to anyone who profits from your weakness. And that's why they hate fathers like Deion Sanders or LeVar Ball, who play an integral part in their sons' lives. You know, and then, you know, if one of their sons might uh, backtrack or stumble, they always are there to celebrate, man. Right? Knowledge is a threat. Progress is a threat. When a man raises his children with structure and righteousness, hostile forces lose leverage, and that's what they want. They want that leverage against us. You know, that's why it's imperative to be in your children's lives. You know, now I know a lot of brothers' circumstances aren't the same. Sometimes you are paired with a demon, But you always have to, keep fighting, man, and keep praying that Yahweh Shem Shai can rectify that situation because he's the father of spirits. He's the one that is controlling those demons on that particular person. Um, this is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 22. For wisdom, which is the worker of all things, taught me. So you have to have righteous wisdom, wisdom of Yahweh Shem Yahushua, spiritual wisdom and understanding, not the wisdom of this world, man. Because you always have to take into account that this devil is created to be a liar and a producer of lies, you know? So you can't always take what he says dealing with his medical industry, his medicines, his data, his statistics. You can't always take that with a grain of salt, man. A lot of it is a bunch of bullshit. It says, for in her is a understanding spirit, holy, which holy means separate, one only, manifold, subtle, lively, clear, undefiled, plain, not subject to hurt, loving the thing that is good, quick, which cannot be letted, ready to do good. And Esau, his wisdom is not ready to do good, man. It's ready to do evil. It's ready to detour you from the goodness and righteousness of the Heavenly Father and His Son, man. The God of this world is the spiritual demon Satan. And he hates. Well, he doesn't hate, but he's an adversary to righteousness. He's created to be on the left-hand side. It says, kind to man, steadfast, sure, free from care, having all power, overseeing all things, and going through all understanding, pure and most subtle spirits. For wisdom is more moving than any motion. She passeth and goeth through all things by reason of her pureness. For she is the breath of the power of Yahweh and a pure influence flowing from the glory of the Almighty. Therefore can no defiled thing fall into her. So how can Esau have wisdom when he's defiled? How can this Edomite have true wisdom if he's defiled? But yet our people, they worship him as if he's a god. And they believe everything he says as if it's the God-given truth. And it's not. It says, for she is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of the Most High and the image of his goodness. And being but one, she can do all things. And remaining in herself, she maketh all things new. And in all ages, entering into holy souls, she maketh them friends of the Most High and prophets. Right? Because wisdom is a feminine spirit, man. Because a feminine spirit is a nurturer. Wisdom is supposed to nurture you, right? Because that's what women do. They're the ones that are the nurturers. It says, for the Most High loveth none but him that dwelleth with wisdom. So that wisdom is synonymous to being kryptonite to these Edomites, man. And that's why, you don't see hordes of people lining up in front of these camps trying to learn wisdom, man. Because Esau is making it so to to suppress it because it's a threat. Just as they did pass this law dealing with federal student loan because too many Jake were going to school, man. Too many Jakes were trying to obtain an education, which was becoming a threat to the progression of these so-called white people, man. They don't want you Israelites on their level, man. You know, they want you in the streets, intoxicated or on some sort of narcotic, or committing crime and committing murder so they can put you back into slavery, man. Because slavery still exists. You know, if you get convicted of a crime, you could be forced into manual labor, right? You look at those individuals that killed Fulio, the rapper. They said, let's not put him to death. They gave the Stephen approach. Nah, let's not. They want to chop you up and do this. Nah, I said, sell him to such and such place. Where he's gonna be breaking big rocks into little rocks. So now they want that sweat equity, man. Right? Lashuan Kodash, Ruach, I think it's Shaw, Yahweh, the spirit of Yahweh, Tahar, Ashapaya, etymology, Ruach, breath, spirit, animating force. Let me see. Wait, hold on. It says I, I, and Z. Let's see, who's I? So eyes, strength. Whoa, yeah, of course. Strength, might, power. Hashapaya, influence, flow, impact. Layman commentary, wisdom itself as a weapon, it empowers, enlightens, and strengthens. It says those who rely on control, manipulation, or ignorance fear wisdom because it breaks chains. This is why knowledge is often treated as dangerous because it removes the excuses used to justify persecution. I'll read it again. It says this is why knowledge is often treated as dangerous, you know? And that's what these Edomites fear. They fear an educated Negro. And back in the day, they used to make fun of those Jakes that were educated. Because these Edomites, they're not as smart as, they perceive to be, because a lot of those inventions that they invented were invented by Jake anyway. They passed laws in which Jake wasn't allowed to get patents or to have credit for things that they've invented or created. It says because it removes the excuses used to justify persecution. And they always want to be justified in their persecution, man. This is Hosea chapter 4. I'm going to the Amplified version. Verse 6, it says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge of my law, where I reveal my will, right? And that's the main knowledge that our people need in order to reverse course. Because you, the priestly nation, have rejected knowledge. You rejected the knowledge of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushua by refraining from listening to his prophets, telling you that this is the way, walk ye there in it. I will also reject you from being my priest, since you have forgotten the law of your power. I will also forget your children, because we are our children coming back in the regeneration. So going back to co-pilot Lashon Kodash, Anya Na Shakat Ma Bali or Bala or Balai Da'ath. Da'ath, knowledge, awareness, discernment. Na Shakath, ruined, corrupted, destroyed. Layman commentary, ignorance makes a people easy to control, easy to mislead, and easy to persecute. A population without knowledge becomes vulnerable to systems that exploit them, right? And these systems that Esau sets up are set up to exploit you. And he even goes as far as he doesn't even care if it is done to his own people, man, as long as the Israelites are not back into power. It says this is why progression, mental, spiritual, economic, is often treated as a threat by those who benefit from disorder. And these Edomites, they benefit from that disorder, man. Right? Start at verse 48 because this is also a strain to the progression of our people. They believe that the answers are in these government regulated churches. This is Acts chapter 7, verse 48. However, the Most High, the one infinitely exalted above humanity, does not dwell in houses made by human hands, as the prophet Isaiah says, which is these churches. So his spirit is not in these churches. It says, heaven is my throne and the earth is the footstool for my feet. What kind of house would you build for me, says Yahweh, or what place is there for my rest? Was it not my hand that made all these things? You stiff-necked and stubborn people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are always actively resisting the Holy Spirit. You are doing just as your fathers did, which goes back to the children. The children are the fathers through the regeneration. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who proclaimed beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become. You who received the law as ordained and delivered to you by angels, by messengers, and yet you did not obey. And this is going to the death of Stephen. Now When they heard this accusation and understood its implication, they were cut to the heart, to the mind and spirit, right? And they began grinding their teeth in rage at him because people hate the truth. They hate wisdom. But he, being full of the Holy Spirit and led by him, gazed into heaven and saw the glory, the great splendor and majesty of Yahweh, and Yahweh Shai standing at the right hand of Yahweh. And he said, "Look, I see the heavens opened up in welcome, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of Yahweh." But they shouted with loud voices and covered their ears, and together rushed at him, considering him guilty of blasphemy. Then they drove him out of the city and began stoning him. And the witnesses placed their outer robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. They continued stoning Stephen as he called on Yahweh Shai and said, "One Yahweh Shai, receive and accept and welcome my spirit." Then, falling on his knees in worship, he cried out loudly, "Yahweh Shai, do not hold this sin against them. Do not charge them." When he had said this, he fell asleep in death. You know, going back to co-pilot Lashwan Kadash, Na'ai, the Na'ada Qualia, Balab, cut, pierced, pricked in the heart, the car, to pierce, stab, wound, lob, heart, mind, inner man. Layman commentary, truth itself cuts the enemy. Stephen's words expose corruption, hypocrisy, and wickedness. So they reacted violently, right? When truth threatens power, persecution becomes the excuse. And that's what they are assumed to do to the true prophets, man. This is the pattern: knowledge threat, progress threat, truth threat, deviancy accusations, justification for persecution. And that's the reason why they set up these individuals to promote a certain image to justify their oppression. I meant to say oppression, not persecution. This is how enemies respond when their control is challenged, right? Layman summary: when a man builds his household with discipline, wisdom, and truth, enemies lose their advantage. Knowledge threatens their control. Progress threatens their narrative. And when they cannot stop growth, they label it deviancy to justify persecution. This is why the righteous grieve the enemy, because strength, order, and truth expose their weakness, right? And it's 144. So Barak Yahweh Shem Yahweh Shai, the water Yahweh Shem Yahweh Shai, Salak Yahweh Shem Yahweh Shai. I'm going to say, I hope at least one brother of the elect was edified. And Shabbat Shalom.